All right, well, we might as well go ahead and get started. I'm Tom Riddell. I'm the session coordinator, the little name tag says, and I'm also the faculty member that this work has come out of. I teach a first-year seminar on the history of the hospital. I taught it for a long time, from 1998 through 2005, and then I took a break and recently retired from the faculty and from the administration and taught the course again this fall. And so these projects have come out of the experience of that first-year seminar. This session's about memorializing the history of the hospital, and we're going to talk a little bit about Northampton State Hospital Memorial Park and then some other efforts that are directed towards memorializing the history of the hospital. And we're going to go in the order that's on the program, and I'm going to start out with a little bit of sort of perspective and place setting. This is a view of the hospital, which is no longer there. You can sort of see it. Maybe turn the lights down a little bit. It might help a little bit. This is from McDonald roof, where people don't often go. But it's a view across the river and across the athletic fields and then up to Hospital Hill. And as you can see, the oldest part of the hospital sat on top of Hospital Hill and extended. This is south and that's north, so it ran south to north across the top of the hill. And that's from 1999. And then this is a view of the old main building. This building, the central part of it was constructed in 1856 to 1858. Construction started in 1856, and then it was opened to the first patients in 1858. And this is from April, about 12 years ago. And that's February 2005, and again it's from south to north. The two end bits were added to the hospital as the patient population increased in the early part of the 20th century. And so by the time the hospital closed, completely closed in 1993, this building had existed and then expanded, and then over on the other side of Route 66 there are some other buildings that were part of the hospital, and Sarah will say a little bit more about that. One more view of the hospital, mostly looking at the south wing. This is prior to its complete demolition in 2006, 2007. It started being demolished in the summer of 2006, and then it was finally completely razed in January of 2007.
How are those the beech trees?
Yeah, oh yeah, right, thanks, John. So this is the row of beech trees that are still there. I think all of them are still there. The big, huge pine trees are gone. And so that gives you a little bit of perspective from what it looks like at the moment. At the moment, as the class knows, and some of you who live up there also know, there's a park in front of where the beech trees are now. Yeah. So those beech trees were in front of the south wing of the hospital. In 1997, the state and the city issued a request for proposals for redeveloping the hospital in April of 1997, actually. And one clause in that request was that developers were asked to cooperate, in essence, and to support efforts to memorialize the history of the hospital. And in a series of decisions, there were Community Builders was the original master developer, and then Mass Development joined as co-master developers, but in essence, Mass Development has taken over as the developer of the Northampton State Hospital property. The city has had a Citizens Advisory Committee council throughout the period of considering the redevelopment of the hospital site. That committee meets and provides advice to community builders and mass development. Mass development and community builders are in charge of development on the site, but the city's advisory committee does have a role in giving feedback and ideas and reacting to proposals that mass development comes up with. The Citizens Advisory Committee created a memorial committee. That committee's been working, thinking, making proposals, chewing over ideas, and recently, last fall, submitted a proposal to the city's Community Preservation Act Committee to create a memorial park on the site, commemorating the history of the hospital, and they were awarded a $75,000 grant from the Community Preservation Act Committee, and then that was approved by City Council in January. The memorial park, I'm going to switch to, whoops, sorry. Part of the memorial park includes, and I meant to show it in one of the other pictures, but I forgot to. Oh well. This shows a scene that's pretty much up to date. It's from November. It shows where the memorial park will be. The memorial park is located pretty much where the original fountain was located, and I'll show you a couple of, I may have shown you some images of that before and forgot to notice it, but this is a row of houses along Olander Street. This is Ford Crossing, and the memorial park's going to be right about in here. And it's a dedicated piece of property that Mass Development identified and has said, here's some layout of the site. It's conceptual, but that's where the memorial park will be. This is the lower part of the memorial park. The streets up that way, and that's the last house in the row on Olander. And this site is where the fountain originally was, and you can just see that's the original base of the fountain where it was. And it's basically been covered over. There's dirt on top of it, soil on top of it. There are a couple of trees apparently growing through it, but the original base of the fountain is still there, still visible. And this is a view from the last house in that row of houses. It is at my back when I took this picture, and so this little hill is basically where the fountain was. It was right about, probably right in there. Is where the fountain originally was. And the idea is to create a memorial park that restores the fountain and then also has some historical markers that capture some of the history of the hospital. And that's one of the things that the students in my class focused on. And that leads right into Sarah. So Sarah McDonald's next. And I'll let everybody introduce themselves in order as they come up.
Okay, so as Tom mentioned, I am Sarah McDonald, and I've been working with a project on the Northampton State Hospital for the past 2 years, and last semester was the peer tutor for the first year seminar on the hospital. And so in kind of trying to think about this memorial and there's been a consensus to include some of the history of the hospital so people who are visiting now, seeing the condominiums and apartments and single-family homes, have some sense of the long history of what was at this site, and then also kind of locating it beyond that into trends in the history of the treatment of mental illness in the United States. And so I'm going to first run you through what is my proposal for a timeline marker for the Memorial Park. So this would be one of multiple markers at the site, just kind of a proposal of certain dates to be included. And this timeline starts in 1856 with the laying of the cornerstone for what was then called the Northampton Lunatic Asylum, and the subsequent construction of this building, which, as Tom mentioned, wouldn't have included the two things on the very side, but this is what's called Old Main and was the original building complex at the hospital. And then in 1858, the first patient was admitted. In 1864, Dr. Pliny Earle was appointed superintendent. And I'm sorry, like, the computer changed my font because I did it on a Mac, so I do know how to spell, but it cut things out. And so sorry that everything doesn't really line up quite right. But he took over from the first superintendent, Dr. Henry Prince, in 1864. And Earle was very influential both at Northampton State Hospital and then just in general in the treatment of mental illness, which I'll get to a little later.
Is Earl Street named for him?
It is, yes. And in 1900, the hospital was already well over capacity and was described in reports of the time as overcrowded. In 1903, a legislative act changed the name from Northampton Lunatic Asylum to Northampton State Hospital, which kind of signals some societal changes in the way we think about mental illness and the terminology that we use, which obviously has evolved a lot throughout time. In 1928 to 1932 was the construction of the Memorial Complex, which Tom mentioned is on the other side of Route 66. So if you're driving up this way, up Hospital Hill, if you look to your right is where Old Main would have been, and to the left is where the Memorial Complex would have been.
So the first superintendent was Prince?
Yes.
Right, and so a part of 66 is Prince Street, which,
And then in the
I'm just a
19...
little confused. So
Yeah.
going away from town, this is on the right-hand side or the left-hand side?
right,
This is the right-hand
This is
side.
the right
So the
hand
left-hand side is where the big
Okay.
Cole Morgan building is, and Cole Morgan is basically where the Memorial Complex would have been.
Okay.
So the 1950s saw the introduction of a lot of medications that really shifted the treatment of mental illness in the United States, and these were used in Northampton State Hospital and across the country and really had a huge impact on the treatment of mental illness. 1955 was the peak patient population at the hospital, about 2,500 patients. And to just give some sense of the crowding, this was a building that was originally constructed to house 200 patients. Granted, it was a smaller, there are more buildings being added, but still, this was never intended to house 2,500 people. In 1955, the hospital farm closed, and up until this point, it had been a really important source of work for patients and providing food and money. But in 1967, work therapy was outlawed under Congress's Anti-Peonage Act, and this regulated work in prisons and institutions like mental hospitals where consent work is an issue. In 1969, hospital organization was moved from type and severity of disorder, where people with more severe disorders would be located out towards the ends of the buildings, to a system of geographically organized unitization. So people from the local area would be here, and you'd have, for example, the Holyoke Chicopee unit, so locally organized. And in the 1970s was really when the deinstitutionalization process started to come about, and commitment hearings began for patients. So every patient, it had to be actually evaluated by doctors and staff, do they really need to be here? And the community project and the geriatric care team initiated patient placement into nursing homes in the community, which resulted in a reduction of the patient population by 2/3. And the 1978 consent decree, which you will hear more about, was also very influential at Northampton and across mental hospitals in the country in really mandating this move toward deinstitutionalization and thinking about alternatives to institutionalization. In 1986, Old Main closed and remaining patients were moved to the Memorial Complex. And then in 1993, the last 12 patients left Northampton State Hospital and were mostly moved to other institutions. And then in 2006, Old Main was demolished after years of controversy in the community. It actually ended up on a ballot vote to see what it would mean to save this building and if it was practical and if it was moral and all sorts of things.
Sarah, before you shift, you want to point out where the fountain is?
Oh yeah, so you can see the fountain
Perspective.
right, which is now all covered by
Where
trees.
was the farm, do you know?
The farm was behind the hospital kind of, and what's now a lot of open land run by Smith Voke, and there's a Frisbee golf course and all kinds of
It's
open
not
land back
really
there.
Northampton Community Gardens is now. Yeah, it's part of it.
That's part of it. The
Yeah.
hospital property was huge, and so now the jail and all of that land where the walking paths are part of Smith's campus down the hill, and all of the stuff on the other side of Route 66 all was a hospital property. So it's really, you're looking at a huge amount of land.
There were a lot of farm buildings behind Old Main, so looking behind it is to the west. And there were a bunch of farm buildings right behind this old building. And then the farm where, they raised animals, they grew stuff, was mostly down the hill and by the river. So out to the west.
In what is now called the dog park?
Yeah, right.
That was all farm.
Did they make enough food to feed the patients?
They did, and I will get to that a little bit, because one thing about making a timeline like this is there's really only so much you can include. And so one of the struggles I came across is there are so many different dates that are important, and just trying to find a balance between providing a context and giving specific dates relevant to this hospital. So I am now going to walk you through kind of some of the other details that are important and may appear in parts on other historical markers throughout the park, or if there's some way of incorporating, because these aren't the only facts and dates that are important to the hospital's history. So before that, to get a little bit of a background context, one important date is in the early 1700s, the development of the moral treatment philosophy was credited to a family in England, and this would have a huge influence on reformers and the people who are constructing these hospitals in mostly the mid-19th century. And so Dorothea Dix was a reformer who's credited really with the development of the mental asylum in America, and her visits to jails and poorhouses shed light on the really inhumane treatment of people with mental illness in these institutions, and she ended up calling for institutions like what would become the Northampton State Hospital. And that's in the mid-19th century, and around that same time, you have Thomas Kirkbride, who was a hospital superintendent, and he's really credited with the kind of this layout. And you see here what's called the linear plan, or is now often referred to as the Kirkbride plan. And Kirkbride was really influenced by the philosophy of moral treatment and came up with this linear plan, which is often referred to as a bat wing shape, which really takes into account ventilation and organization of patients, where you have, as I mentioned, organized by severity of disorder. And so his plans, and he made publications and treatises on the construction of hospitals and kind of also a little bit on treatment, but a lot of treatment really depended on the actual physical building at this time. And so the Northampton State Hospital, of which this is a floor plan, was a Kirkbride plan building, as were many, many institutions throughout the country. And then a little bit of other context within the state. Mcclain Asylum was built in 1818 in Somerville as the first. This was a private institution. It's actually now in Belmont, but private institution, so you have a lot of famous, wealthy people who are able to go here. And then with the development of public institutions, this is kind of where the ordinary people, I guess, go to fun. And so the first public institution in the state was Worcester Insane Asylum, which opened in 1832. So Northampton State Hospital was the third public institution in the state. And then kind of to dig a little more in depth about some of these other dates, I thought an interesting fact is that the first patient at Northampton State Hospital was a woman. And when you look through the hospital records of who were the people in these institutions, some really interesting patterns emerge. You have a lot of women, definite majority, a lot of immigrants, and a lot of the women are middle-aged women, and this is a time when divorce is frowned upon. And so what do you do when your wife becomes a burden? There's the mental hospital. So you have kind of middle-aged women, young women who got pregnant, and things like that, which is kind of, opens some.
It's also a time when women's sexuality was considered to be very problematic, and it's that I believe it's the time of clitoridectomies being prescribed by doctors for hysterical.
Yes. And then I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on why, because obviously there were more superintendents at Northampton State Hospital than just Dr. Earle. But I thought that he was the most important to include because he's really influential, and he ended up publishing The Curability of Insanity, which is widely recognized, and so his influence extended a lot beyond just Northampton State Hospital. And he really was influential in bringing moral treatment and work therapy to the hospital. And some of the dates where you can see the influence of this: in 1869, he had a fence constructed so that patients could leave the hospital and wander the grounds. In 1870, a greenhouse was constructed as part of his work therapy program. And between 1867 and 1885, even though this was a public state-funded institution, the hospital actually received no state subsidy because it was able to exist solely on the income of the farm. And the farm became nationally known. It provided work for the patients and food for the hospital, and also was sold in the community. And then, as you may have...
Locally grown.
Yeah. So, as you saw, I included the construction of the memorial complex, but a lot of buildings were added to the hospital property over time, which include but are not limited to the construction of the infirmary for women in 1903. In 1914, a clubhouse or rec building was built for men, which included a bowling alley and all sorts of things, and they built a pavilion covering for women. So. In 1938, the Oleander Cafeteria was built with Works Progress Administration funds. And in 1953, the AP building was built on the Memorial campus to house tuberculosis patients.
And this is the...
this is a picture of the Memorial complex from down the hill behind it. So on the other side of the building would be Route 66, and this is you're looking from below.
So it's about from Laurel Street.
Yeah.
Are those pillars, domes on the tops of the buildings functional in some way?
Heating and ventilation. And the old main had a lot of similar towers on the top, which people frequently think were for
guards.
Guard towers or observation towers or something like that, but they were for heating and ventilation. An old main, can
do you want me to go back to the...
Yeah, go back to the... used to have a big, huge cupola on top, and at some point or another it disappeared. And I still haven't been able to figure out exactly why. I think it has to do with one of the points at which there were renovations to the building. But I still haven't been able to absolutely figure that out. There's a famous painting that the college owns, Thomas Farrar, a view of Northampton before college was built, and so showing sort of rural mid-19th century terrain and geography of the Connecticut River Valley, and it was apparently painted from the cupola. On Sundays, they used to let people go up and have like picnics and look at it.
The painting's on the third floor gallery in the museum right over there.
Where is it, the painting?
The third floor gallery of the museum right here, the Smith Museum. Okay. And then when medications were introduced, a couple of the most important ones, 1952 was the introduction of Thorazine, which was the first antipsychotic. 1955, Equinel was the first widely used tranquilizer, and in 1957, imipramine was the first antidepressant. But medications obviously were not the only treatments, and before the development of medication, there were a lot of other treatments, or a lot of times there's a fine line between treatments and disciplinary measures that were used, but electroshock therapy was used at the state hospital beginning in 1940. Psychosurgery, lobotomies were occasionally conducted in the late 40s. And hydrotherapy, which is submersion in ice baths basically, and wet packs, which they would soak bed sheets in ice cold water and wrap people from their chin to their toes for an extended period of time, were also used up through pretty recently. And then I thought that kind of the peak patient population provides a good point to think about the broader context, because it actually lines up exactly with the peak patient population in Northampton State Hospital and the peak of patients in mental hospitals across the United States, which peaked at 560,000 people. And then just also taking it back to the personal level and what it would have meant to be one of these 2,500 people crowded into this building, because one thing that you don't see from the timeline are all these personal stories of the people who lived there. And so one thing that we've been trying to also do with this project is, talk to people and get their stories and make sure that what we're doing is sensitive. And because I think sometimes when you're just seeing these dates and it's very isolated from, what actually happened. And then after the institutionalization and let's see. So basically there's this national trend toward the institutionalization, which I talked about. And in 1979, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, which is a support and advocacy group, was founded. And they and other groups really are advocating the shift toward community-based programs. And you definitely see this happening in Northampton. One example is ServiceNet, which has multiple locations throughout Northampton and Western Mass in general, and is a really great resource. And the legacies of deinstitutionalization also really extend beyond just the hospital closing. The levels of homelessness in Northampton can definitely, in part, be traced back to deinstitutionalization, and there are also continuing issues of the stigma of mental illness and what it means to live through that. And additionally, this timeline only takes us through the demolition of Old Main and the actual buildings there, but the property has evolved a lot since then too, and so thinking about what's there now, because people who are going to be visiting the Memorial Park will obviously be seeing someplace very different, and so a lot of what we talked about in the course also involved the redevelopment and what's happened since then at what is now Village Hill, Northampton. And an interesting note is that Village Hill, Northampton was originally the village at Hospital Hill, but they edited that out and it's kind of this erasure of what used to be there that's really requires us to, have things like the Memorial Park and this history to keep the legacy of what used to be there around. Yes.
I wonder if you could show us approximately where Old Main was as an overlay on the current map.
Yes. So, let's see. If this is so these are the apartments. So it would have been right about here, because these are where the beech trees are.
Yes.
And so those would have been, we saw in that picture that Tom showed.
Right, so
So it would have gone,
these are the beech trees.
yeah,
so-
these
yeah.
here.
So it
And
would
this
have
is
been-
where the fountain, the Memorial Park is, so that's pretty close to the original fountain location. So
The main
you're kind of
entrance
looking
was
at-
behind the beech trees or behind the fountain?
The main entrance was right across from.
right across from the fountain. So if the fountain's here, it would have been about here-ish. And so you have it here, and then the beech trees are in front of the side, because when you have the, kind of the south wing would have been
Yeah,
here-ish.
all right. And so this is Hilltop West. It used to be the South Employees Building. And then pretty much straight north was the North Employees Building, which is the one that they just demolished
Right.
recently. And the building basically ran, north-south in between this one and the one that they just demolished.
Thank
So the
you.
one that's left there, that they're proposing for a hotel, what was that?
That's, I'm going to show 'em which one.
This
that-
one here,
um,
the mail attendance building.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that would have been mail attendance building. So the ones that are still around, that are the old buildings, are the South Employees Home, the Nurses Home, and both of these have already been converted into private
Actually,
buildings.
okay, so this is the new one, so that's the
Oh, the-
South Employees, this
okay,
is the gatehouse.
Oh, that's the thing they're
No,
just
that's
building
not the
now.
gatehouse, that doesn't exist.
Right, okay. And then this,
Oh, right, yeah, it doesn't exist, you're right. Yeah, the gatehouse is down here.
is down right
Yeah,
there.
right, yeah,
So South Employees Home, Nurses Home, mail attendance building.
right.
So does the mail attendance building date from the 1850s, 80s?
I forgot.
I have
to
the
bring-
date on it, but not,
Yeah, and I
right
forgot
here.
to bring my.
I can pull it up, but it would take a minute.
Yeah.
So it's not dating all the way from the 1850s, but it's,
Still 19th, early 19th century.
Yeah,
or early
Yeah.
20th.
the
Early 20th.
Haskell
Early 20th,
building, the
sorry.
sort of airplane looking kind of one that's still there, that was built
In the
in the
1950s.
50s.
It looks it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does, it does.
There wasn't any on-site housing for employees when the hospital was originally built. Instead, they
Oh.
built houses, a series of houses along Laurel Street and Birdsford Road that are
Oh.
still there.
Interesting.
Those were all original
Huh.
state hospital housing.
The Google Earth imagery goes back into the 90s. So you can move the slide bar on Google Earth and see the old buildings appear
Wow.
on top of where the new buildings are.
Wow.
It's definitely a good thing to do.
Wow.
Nice. All right,
Anything else?
That's really good.
thanks, sir.
That's great.
Hi, I'm Niamh Sweetnam. Before I start talking about the text for the marker and what I'm going to put on there, I'm going to tell a quick story. So when my grandmother was 3 years old, it was on New Year's Eve. Her father and her mother, so my great-grandparents, were hit by a logging truck traveling. It got out of control, and so this was my grandmother's turning 80 this year, so this was about a little over 75 years ago. And my great-grandmother ended up in the hospital with in critical condition, and the doctor in the end suggested when she was off the critical list that she could go to Northampton State Hospital for some electric shock because she probably had PTSD or something. I mean, she was critically injured by a logging truck. So she ended up in there, and this family lore goes that she called up her own mother, or wrote to her mother and said, "Come get me out." And her mother drove up and came up and got her out. I don't know exactly how truthful this story is, but it's interesting family historian, so that's sort of why I was interested in this course. So I'm going to be talking about the consent decree, which is also other people trying to get out of the hospital. So this picture, it was on the official documents. I've looked for where it came from, and I couldn't find any information on it. But so it started off as a civil action case, and it was a lawsuit between David Brewster was the main. It's become known as Brewster versus Dukakis. Dukakis being the governor of Massachusetts. And then there was this judge, and that's his signature, and that's Dukakis' signature. But it actually involved, these are all the plaintiffs. And then you have the representation with the Massachusetts Association for Mental Health. And then all these going over there are the people, the defendants. So there's quite a lot. Obviously, Dukakis is right here, but there's also, Commissioner of Mental Health. So these were all the people involved with, and this is, again, original court documents. So this was, in general, they basically said their rights were violated because they should be treated in a less restrictive to an alternative, their rights to be treated appropriately in less restrictive alternatives suitable to their needs. So a lot of this was sort of, now we've moved towards ServiceNet and those community programs. That's what they were aiming for. So I did not know what a consent decree was when I started out, but it's when it starts with a lawsuit and both parties agree to come to a settlement without going through the courts. Court is involved, but there's a lot less publicity, and it's simpler. So that's overall the consent decree, just so you know. And this is the signing of the consent decree, so they all agreed. And I just love how all these documents are available. So there were over 200 pages of text for the document. And they basically called for 400 patients to be discharged in 3 years, and they would enter community programs better suited for their needs, and then the money that was going to the hospital would go to these programs. So residents and clients should be entitled to the least restrictive, most normal residential alternative and receive appropriate treatment, training, and support suited to their individual needs. So you get a lot of least restrictive and individual needs coming up. And this I thought was interesting. They did some math and decided that there were over 2,000 people who will or would have ended up in the hospital within the time, and that there actually could result in the unnecessary institutionalization. Oh dear. Well, the numbers were, by the first year, they wanted to have it down to 250, and then the next summer they wanted the numbers down to 150, and then by the next summer they wanted there just to be 50 patients left, so they would have been out by the early 80s. Interestingly, the consent decree never actually called for the closing of the hospital. So it was sort of one of those legal jargon. It didn't happen. Not only did the patients not leave, but the funds were never transferred from the hospital to the community programs. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until 1993 that the last patients left, which was 10 years later than they were supposed to in the original decree. And this is where I got all the actual documents. So if you're interested in the actual court documents, you can find them at this website. And do you have any questions? Yes.
You said that there were first number you said was 400 patients in the consent decree.
Yeah, I may be getting the numbers wrong with the one that this is supposed to have the actual numbers, and I'm trying to I just remembered them off my top of my head, but again, I worked on a Mac, transferred it to PC and the numbers aren't coming up. You can see.
But I just wondered why was it 400 in the suit? Was that because that was how many were in the state hospital at the time? Or it just was a convenient number?
I'm not sure. I think it must have been around that how many were in the hospital at that time.
It was probably more than that, but
So they were referring to 400 patients remaining, not 400 patients to be placed out that year.
I'm not sure. I know they definitely wanted 50 people to be left in the end. So discharged with, so 400 patients in all would be discharged within the 3 years. And there had been some work towards the deinstitutionalization already. So this was just sort of the final.
So
and the patient population had been declining since 1955 rather steadily.
So 400 might be how many patients
So
approximately?
probably
I can't remember
450.
Yeah, and I can't remember what the population was in 1978.
In 78,
Yeah,
about 1,200.
yeah, so,
My guess, around
Yeah.
1,200.
yeah, and there's in some of the materials for the course, we've got a thing that outlines the patient population as it increases and decreases over time, like you bring it up at the moment.
So where they say in 3 years, which year
So it's
was the first year?
78, well, it was late 78, so
Yeah.
in 79, 80, 81.
Yeah, the consent decree was December 15th in 76 that they started the lawsuit. Then the consent decree happened in December 2 years later, and so.
And then the document that you had from Friedman, which basically says they haven't done what they said they were going to do.
This one?
No.
This one.
Yeah, that one. So that's 3 years later.
3 years later, yeah.
A little bit less than 3 years later, and he's saying that, you haven't done what you said you were going to do.
Because there were 2,000 patients there in 1970, and at least 800 of geriatric patients were placed out of the hospital between 70 and 76. Of course, some were still admitted. It was not a... The number was always moving.
So one idea for a marker would be to have something about the consent decree. And
Oh yeah.
You
So
got
this
that.
is sort of the information I want to put on the marker with I'll try. I'd love to incorporate the official documents into it as well, but basically it's mostly going to be text, sort of stating a more in-depth timeline of the actual consent decree.
Right, and we'll get the numbers right.
Yeah, I do have I have written it, but I don't have it with the.
Right, super.
Hi.
Thanks, Niamh.
Okay. My name is Viola Castagna, and I came to Northampton in the fall, and I didn't know that there had been a hospital up on the hill behind campus. So looking through the course catalog and choosing my classes, it was something that I became interested in knowing more about the history of the area. So that kind of is that's why I chose to do the class. But what I was aware of when I started was that there's probably a lot of people that don't know about it, especially people that are younger, that are maybe my age, that haven't been long-time residents of Northampton. And so I decided to I don't know if I want to stop it. I don't know what it's doing. So I...
Whoops. Just hit no on that, please. Yeah.
And so I decided that I would make both a blog and a Facebook page to update the community about the memorial park that's being created, and because part of memorializing something is making sure that it's not completely forgotten, and to me that meant making sure that more people knew about it. And so I decided to, oh man. Okay, well.
Right. Explorer or something, it's trying to go through Chrome.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, thank you. And I also, I'm sorry. Okay. And so, because I knew that a lot of people use websites such as Tumblr and Facebook, I decided that I would make a blog about it, which I hoped it would provide a variety of sort of multimedia representations of the hospital in the different kind of phases of its existence. I mean, the majority of it is images from after deinstitutionalization, after it was closed, but I also tried to include images from during its operation, particularly of just the hospital, and I didn't focus particularly on patients, but it was interesting to find my sources for the blog because I found a lot of additional information that added to my own knowledge about the hospital. And so that's what I wanted to share with people by creating a blog. And I also tried to talk about like I have information on the Kirkbride complexes and how that origin story a bit, and
Go
just
hold that one for a second.
So memorial. This is Old Main, right? You can see the collapsed
Portico,
Yeah.
right, which means that it was somewhere around 2003 or 4 or something like that.
Oh, I got this from. I got this image from a urban exploration website. So, and I also considered the other efforts that have been made to memorialize the hospital. And something that we looked at in class was habeas corpus, which was a musical installation before the hospital was demolished. And it was part of this is my own interpretation and writing about, because it's and yeah, so mostly what I put onto the blog was an exploration of the hospital after its closing, but what I look at more often, especially lately, is I created a Facebook community page for the Memorial Park, which has updates when I get them from other sources. And I also I got my beginning information for the park from Professor Riddell and Barbara Blumenthal, who works at the Mortimer Rare Book Room, who has played a large part in the community efforts to memorialize the hospital. And so, because the centerpiece of the park is going to be the fountain, I put images of how it, and also just some older images of the hospital, so just to, as a reference to what this park is memorializing.
So where did you get most of your images?
I got these. Barbara came to our classroom one day, and as I was talking to her about what I should put on the page, what she recommended, she told me about these images, and she'd used them in her own presentation that she gave to us. And so she forwarded them to me, and as a matter of where she got them, I'm not really sure, but as a class, we we did go to see the fountain at the DPW, so it's accessible.
It's been removed. It was removed sometime after 2001. I can't remember exactly when. It's been in storage at DPW, quote unquote storage. It's outside of their yard.
And
So Jackie's the source.
And
And that's from when it was still there and obviously way overgrown.
And what's it made out of?
What is
Cast iron.
Cast iron?
That's why it's nested in it. So I've also included images of the plans.
Cement, that image, that lid that you showed extending out around.
Yeah, cement.
Ceramic wrap.
It's just much better quality on my computer. And so I have some images that have already been seen before, like the master plan for Village Hill and the location of the park and that. And so it's just a matter of, well, only 55 people have liked it so far. I mean, it's not very many people, but...
It hasn't gone viral yet.
No, not yet.
If you tell a ghost story about the old state hospital, it would.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's probably right.
And it's interesting because people have also...
And that's Dan back there. Dan, Viola.
Oh, cool. No. I don't know if I'll log in. But, like, okay, maybe I should, because it's interesting what other people have posted, because my classmates have done some interesting, please let this go. Okay, it's gonna go to the page. But it is because it also is a venue for other people to post about the hospital as well too, because like my classmate Janae, she did one of her final projects was an art piece, and she wrote about this. She did an art drawing as well as and so it's kind of a work in process since it continues to be updated at times, but this is what I did for my final project, and it was a bit of an effort sometimes because working on the internet can be highly distracting. But I had a good time compiling the information, and I'm hopeful that it serves to help to get more people so that they know about the hospital, and that's my project.
Okay, I'm Ansell. I created a website about the Northampton State Hospital, and at least personally, I wouldn't really think of an informational-based website as a form of memorialization, but I'll explain later why, for me personally, this was a perfect way to memorialize the hospital. But first, I'm going to explain what my website does. So, my website takes websites that are already online or photos and organizes them into categories such as general information, information on redevelopment, archives, and then it has a brief description of what each of the links are. So I did this because I wanted to create a tool that was useful, to learn, but also saved people time and helped both people who were looking for more information about the hospital, who had a specific topic that they were looking for, but also helped people who knew little about the hospital. So basically, because there's descriptions of the website, there's keywords in there, maybe Village Hill, and if you didn't know anything about the hospital, you might not know to search Village Hill into Google. You might be just going through endless Northampton website articles and not really efficiently finding what you're looking for. So if you go to my website, if you didn't know very much, you can find more efficiently what you wanted. So I guess I'll just show you my website. Yes. Well.
Proceed anyway. You trust yourself.
Yeah, I can just. Oh, why is it not coming up? I think so.
Yeah, it will.
Yeah, just try it.
Go back to the tab at the top. Yeah, that one. And yeah, there you go.
Okay. So this is actually the first website I've ever created. So it's pretty simple, but so on my website, my main page actually has a description of my goal in creating the website. So if you came across it, you'd know actually what was happening. But I include archives, so you can see I have the annual reports, a census, and for example, if you didn't know much.
Click on the census.
If you didn't know, if you didn't.
So 1978, it says that there were somewhere around 400 patients.
What?
In 1975, it's 1975, 600 to 700, and what do you say, Jackie? Somewhere around 1970, just below 2,000.
1970, I said 2,000.
Yeah, so a little below there. Yeah, thank you, Ella. See how useful her website is?
How do you find it? What is the website?
It's through the Smith blogging sites. But for example, if you didn't know a lot about the hospital, you wouldn't know necessarily to search the Brewster consent decree if you were looking for some sort of information. So you could either look at the link I have, or you could use that as a resource to now look Brewster consent decree up for yourself. So then also in main topics, I've
separated it into general information as well as like redevelopment. So like in general information, I don't just have like general information websites. I also have like the Smith College's like suggestions on like books you should look at and like encyclopedia articles that would be helpful, that sort of stuff. And then I have Viola's Facebook page connected on here because it has like more current stuff. And then in terms of like another thing, you wouldn't know Village Hill if you didn't know a lot about the hospital, but a nice thing about my website is if you knew you were searching stuff about Village Hill and wanted to see if my website had any information that was related to your area, you could search like Village Hill in the search bar, and then it would show that I have a link in my redevelopment section. So, and then originally I only wanted to have like informational websites attached, but then as I was searching information, I found that multimedia was actually very interesting. So especially for people who didn't know a lot about the hospital, it would be a way for them to become interested in maybe like then reading something in general information. And a lot, like, I can't entirely remember if I've already mentioned this, but the whole point for me doing this is I did not want to, in how I memorialize the hospital, I did not want to like put my own ideas onto other people because it's kind of a controversial issue. Like there's a lot of varying perspectives on the hospital. So instead, by having like a learning tool, people can learn about the hospital themselves, make up their own ideas, and because it's like active thinking to make your own ideas about something, then hopefully they would remember it for longer. So therefore, memorializing the hospital. Good.
And one of the things that we also thought about in class as we were doing all of this is that on markers, you can also have QR codes, and so there could be a QR code that links to Ella's page and links to Viola's Facebook page and her blog, as well as, maybe to photographic collections.
Hi, I'm Elana. For my project, I wanted to create a memorial focused on acknowledging the patients of the Northampton State Hospital, which I consider to be the biggest part of the hospital history that has been ignored or forgotten. For the memorial, I would like to plant one daffodil for each patient ever admitted in the Northampton State Hospital to show in numbers how many people it affected. These flowers are meant to give respect and acknowledgement to the patients of this hospital who spent years being invisible, looked down upon, and treated horribly. I chose daffodils because they represent forgiveness and faith and return every spring to show the world that they can withstand the harshest environment. My ideal location would have the daffodils be planted on top of the old burial ground because actual patients were buried there when they just threw bodies into the ground with no markers of respect when no family members came to pick them up. In 1980, the hospital admitted its 64,500th patient, so I estimated that around 500 people were admitted in the next 13 years. So my goal is to have a field with 65,000 daffodils. My hope is to plant 10,000 bulbs in the fall, which in 8 years will grow into 65,000 different colored, different shaped daffodils to further represent the diverse population of patients that lived in the Northampton State Hospital. In my research, I looked at other memorial projects that use daffodils. So on Smith College's campus, there's the Wilson Bulb Bank, which is in between Chapin and Wright Hall. And that in 1980, a professor, Jean Wilson, donated money to have a memorial bank of daffodils for her two sisters who had gone to Smith as well. The bank blooms every spring to remind Smithies that winter never lasts. In New York City, for the 9/11 memorial, more than 15,000 volunteers since 2001 have planted over 7 million bulbs in parks around Manhattan. Hans van Vardenberg started the project for the idea of wanting a physical reminder that rebirth can follow tragedy. And at the Massachusetts Mental Health Center, 28,000 potted flowers were installed in a memorial called Bloom. The artist, Anna Sweetnam, who also did the musical project for the Northampton State Hospital, wanted to bring life and color into the building one last time before it was demolished. She had the hallways, rooms, and almost every square foot of the building filled with tulips and allowed visitors to walk through the halls one last time. At the moment, I'm working on making partnerships with landowners in hopes for continual care for the field in years to come. So, any questions?
So where do you want to plant these flowers?
My hope would be the old burial ground, but there's another idea to incorporate the daffodils in the memorial park within the Village Hill area.
Where is the old burial ground?
Oh, it's where the farm used to be. Are you familiar?
Part of the dog park.
Yeah, the dog park. It's the big empty field across the street from where the jail is now.
So it's on the trails up above the river. There's sort of in the open below one of the trails that runs kind of parallel to the river. There's a couple of juniper trees and there's a bench.
Oh yeah, the memorial bench.
Underneath those. And so that's basically where people have determined that the burial ground was. People who died there who didn't have families were buried on site. There are medical records or patient records that indicate the numbers of people who were buried there and presumably their identities, and it's somewhere around 600 is the number, but no grave markers. And patients stopped being buried at the hospital in, do you remember what the year is? Somewhere around the 1920s. And after that, they were used as cadavers at the UMass Med School.
And that's interesting to compare to. There is also a mental health center in Middletown, Connecticut, and they also just buried thousands of bodies with their names not on the gravestones, and instead they just marked them with numbers. So if you go to one of the fields, it's just this giant field with thousands of markers with just numbers, 1 through 3,000, which is compares to them burying it without any. Yeah.
I think you were just exactly on the right track with this. I think this is perfect. Can I make a $20 donation right now?
Well, I was just wondering how perfectly this ties into fundraising.
I'm serious. I'll make a $20 donation right now.
Thank you.
And I'd also like to suggest that you don't spend too much time asking permission. Just go plant your own.
I hardly agree with that. I do. I could see this growing and going on for years and years.
Yes.
I don't know too much about how you plan to execute it, but will
Take
there
your time.
be like a plaque or like?
Yes, that's another. I want to bring with the daffodils to have a plaque to describe the history and the reason why the daffodils are there, and a little bit about. And depending where I plant the daffodils, like if it's in the memorial park near the fountain, that will be another story because it'll be closer to the plaques that are there. Sigal?
Are you planning on getting funding from the city for this project, or is this simply something you need to fund?
It really depends. In this past spring, we have been looking at some grants. It just depends what we decide to go for.
Just give her $20 right now.
Who we work with.
It's a lot easier than trying to get it out of the city, right?
One of the things that we have to figure out is that there is a memorial committee that's responsible for creating and orchestrating the creation of the memorial park. And there's a designated piece of property, and there are ideas that are associated with that and expenses that are going to be associated with it. And one of the things that we have to figure out is what's the relationship between that project and this project. At this point, the committee submitted a proposal for, what was it, Jackie, over $100,000.
121.
Yeah, $120,000, and we got funded for 75. So, you know, that 75 probably isn't going to completely cover the cost of creating the park. And there's going to have to be fundraising associated with that. Elana and I have explored applying for a grant from the Massachusetts Humanities Commission, which is also in town, located in Northampton, across from the post office, and they give $5,000 and sometimes $10,000 grants.
Is the project that expensive? Is it?
Well, I looked at, so just for the bulbs, for 8,000 bulbs, it would be $6,000, and then I estimated that a plaque might cost, like a good one might cost $1,000, and then other expenses, I was, probably the hope is $7,500. Yeah. Which compare, yeah.
So $20 is
Yeah.
And, you know, if you're buying those daffodils in bulk, you'll get a better price. You'll get a much.
That's
Yeah.
buying through the Smith with the discount, so I don't know if there's a better,
Yeah, I mean, we
Okay.
could explore that,
yeah.
Yeah.
do some research.
I mean, Anna Schulich got all those flowers for a song
Oh, really? Okay.
relative to what they would have cost. When you buy 75,000 potted plants at a time.
Yeah, I mean, if you buy them from one place and say that part of the marker's going to include, you know,
Oh, yeah.
information about where you got them, you know, they might give them to you for
Yeah.
a lower price, for example.
Yeah, they can write off some of it as a tax deduction themselves if it's charitable.
Yeah.
You know, they sell you half, give you half, and they get to write off half.
Other questions that people have? Well, thank you all very much. Thank everyone for coming and for presenting. Thank you. That's right. As things develop, Viola will have updates on her Facebook page. So if you're on Facebook, go to Northampton State Hospital Memorial Park and like it.
And
All right. Thank you all.
the other one